what makes a great player is great. And initially couldn't answer the question. He started writing the names of all the great players that he'd coached and he'd played with. And he'd been a part of 10 premierships by this stage of his life. And almost in an act of frustration, he said, Cameron, the best players are better than human nature. They're better than human nature. And I've always loved that response, because human nature will take us into it'll take us into the lazy. It'll take us into the busy. It'll take us into, scrolling when we should be, scrolling our phones instead of reading a book, whatever it might be. When the alarm goes in the morning, I won't go for that walk or that jog or that ride or the gym or whatever it might be. Human nature will mean that we overestimate the challenge we're facing and underestimate our capacity to deal with it. There's all forms of human nature around that.
Welcome to the Profitable Farmer podcast, where we share stories and tips to help you run a better farming business and create your very own freedom farm. If you're looking to work smarter and not harder in your farm business, welcome. You're in the right place. G'day everyone. One of my favourite books is a book called Quiet Leadership. And when I reflect on my discussions with Cameron Schwab, that book comes to mind. Cameron Schwab is an incredible high-performance leadership coach who shares in this conversation some very deep, very thoughtful and very profound reflections on leadership in the high-performance space. And I think it's all entirely relevant to our farming businesses and our farming families and how we turn up in communities, at least as much as it is to the high-performance CEOs and the high-performance athletes, AFL in particular, but certainly other, that Cameron has had the privilege of mentoring and coaching over his journey. So Cameron is the founder and CEO to a company called Design CEO. He leverages his extensive leadership experience in professional sport and business to mentor and support CEOs, senior and emerging leaders, and their organizations across various industry sectors. His goal is to help them build high levels of cultural, strategic, and leadership trust as a basis for sustained high performance. He's been a CEO for over 25 years, leading 3 Australian Football League AFL clubs and transforming them from loss-making, debt-laden and non-competitive entities to profitable, resourceful and highly successful organisations. He's also completed advanced management and coaching programs with Harvard, Columbia and Melbourne Business Schools. He's a certified CEO, an emotional intelligence practitioner and a really profound mentor and coach on this really important topic of high performance. He has a podcast called In the Arena. He's an author. And if you're interested in high performance leadership coaching, you're welcome to reach out to him. I'll provide the details to his business, Design CEO, in the show notes, along with some other resources. But a really in-depth and profound conversation, as I say, that I think can be so relevant to how we each turn up to our families and our businesses and our communities. I hope you enjoy this interview with Cameron Schwab as much as I did. Cameron, it's a real pleasure to have some time with you. I'm so grateful that you've joined us on Profitable Farmer. Thank you so much. How are you?
No, I'm going well, going really well. No, it's a joy to be here. I enjoy these conversations, and as a suburban boy, there's sometimes I've often wondered, when you find yourself in conversation with country folk. I am a country folk now. Well, much to my a lot of my good country folk friends actually laugh at the fact that I live in Dalesford now, so I'm very familiar with. It's a very different country town in that sense, but I'm very familiar with it. My joys of country life very much come from visiting farms. Often the farms I visited, there was the farmer had produced a protege which was such that it attracted the interest of an AFL club in terms of the prospect of that person one day playing for the club. So we used to call it the scone run. You'd go on a scone run. Wherever you'd go, there'd either be a nice cake baked for you or some scones. And we literally, it was mainly around the Goulburn Valley. I was recruiting manager at Melbourne Football Club around that sort of area. So lots of dairy farms, in that area. And we'd find ourselves, we'd do the scone run. Yeah.
So, Cameron, a biased question to start. What sort of a footy player do farmers breed?
All sorts. There's a current coach who's a farmer's son. Justin Longmuir in Fremantle. He grew up on the farm, and my sense of him, because I was CEO of Fremantle when he was a player, my sense of him, and I think if you'd asked him at the time, his ambition in life was just to go back to the farm. I'm trying to think the area it was now, but I think it was one of those very big West Australian properties, and he's now coaching an AFL club. So, farm life, it teaches you lots of things. And I don't think the expectation when he was growing up that the lessons of the farm would actually give him the wherewithal to coach an AFL club. And I think, they're on the cusp of something pretty special, and he'll be a really important reason for that. So I do know that the lessons, and he was like a 6'7" version of that. So he was the classic farmer's kid, if you like, if you're going to create an archetype of what we would hope that the good living of a farm would create, it would be a nice big key position player or a ruckman. That would be the hope. Yeah, but they come in all shapes and sizes. We know that.
They certainly do. Hey, how does a 24-year-old arrive into the CEO position of an elite AFL football club? AFL, 160 years of pretty elaborate history. How do you arrive into a position like that at such a young age?
Yeah, well, probably arrives might be a pretty good description of it, to be honest. I did grow up with the game. So even the stories that I told before about, recruiting and going to the country, and my father, Alan Schwab, was secretary of the Richmond Football Club, which was, the same title really as CEO, and actually it was called the general manager when I first was appointed. It's just title inflation. We inflate titles these days, don't we? You're always a director of something or whatever. Whereas I think it might be the same job, just a better title, and maybe a better salary package, perhaps. But so I remember growing up with these stories. You'd come home and the area of Richmond, they had zones in those days, so you had areas of which you were allocated. And I do remember, my father coming home and telling stories, because he would go up, as the sun raised your area, around Mildura all the way through, some of those little places there. And, he'd come back with stories of players who were going to come out of those areas. So I very much grew up with the game, and Richmond were a very successful club of that era. So I can remember mornings of my childhood where you'd wake up on a Sunday morning in the Premiership Cup that the Tigers had won the day before was sitting on our kitchen table. So it was, there was aspects to my growing up which, and Malcolm Gladwell talks about this, or he made it more popular, certainly this idea of 10,000 hours, the practicing of something for 10,000 hours to build, some form of mastery around whatever that thing is. And there's no doubt that's the farmer's life, isn't it? Often, growing up on the farm is that they're getting their 10,000 hours much earlier than you would be by, say, the process of going to school, going to uni, doing a degree. And really, it's only when you've done the degree that the 10,000 hours actually starts in so many ways. But for me, that started early, and I'd made my mind up without any idea that there would be any prospect in it for me. That I loved the game so much, and I probably fell in love with the game before I fell in love with anything else in life. Is that I remember there was a thing on World of Sport and an old footy show, and on old sports show, and they described the great Kevin Sheedy when he was playing for Richmond as a student of the game. And I remember thinking, that's what I want to be. I want to be a student of the game. And so I really, in really informal ways, just my own notes, my own notebooks, but I did have access to these wonderful football people. And the one who stays in my mind growing up, other than my father, who certainly was one of those people, was a guy, Tom Hafey, who was coach of Richmond at that time. And he was an iconic person and a very generous person. And he was probably my first experience of leadership where, outside of my dad, and who had a clear bias towards me, there was where I realised that the great people in your life aren't people, you certainly feel good about them. And there were obviously people around you who you will feel good about them, some aspect of their capability. They might be charismatic. They might even be good looking. They might just have some part to them. But the great people are people who make you feel good about you. And Tommy Hafey was one of those. So Tommy would come round to our home, or Dad would spend time with him at his home or at the Punt Road Oval at Richmond, and I'd be just tagging along. And I never felt excluded from. I didn't contribute anything really to those conversations, but I never felt excluded from them. And then a few years later, and unfortunately my parents separated when I was in my teens, which was quite a traumatic thing to go through at the time. But when I was doing my last year at school, there was a job advertised in the paper looking for almost, it'd be called an office boy. It was called the assistant to the football manager of the Melbourne Football Club. It wasn't an assistant football manager. It was just an assistant to the football manager. And I applied for the role, and my surname's Schwab, and my father's a well-known person in the game. And I got the role, and the coach of the team was Ron Barassi. And so I've gone from Tom Hafey to Ron Barassi, and I'm 18 years of age. And again, Ron was someone who, even as a very young person, and it might have been because of his relationship with my father, but he saw something in me that I'd never seen in myself, and he encouraged me to go recruiting. And I was just editing out tapes for him and things like that. And I'd find myself in conversation with him, and he suggested I went recruiting, and that's when I started getting in the car and driving up to Shepparton or Kyabram or Rochester or these sorts of places to go and watch players play. And I then got enough confidence to back my judgment to recruit those players, obviously with the support of other people. I was only 19 or 20 at the time, and we ended up making the finals for the first time in 25 years. And I'd recruited most of the players by that point. And then, so I was 24 at the end of that year, and Richmond approached me. I thought they wanted me to come and do the recruiting, because I literally didn't have a degree. I didn't have any. I'd done 6 years in footy, basically, at the Melbourne Football Club, and they asked me to play that role. And there's still parts of me which, even at this stage of life, you still feel that little bit of that imposter thing sort of kicks in, and there's no doubt my situation and circumstances and my privileged upbringing in the sport played a massive role in it. But I managed to do it for the next 25 years. So it was with, a few ups and downs and a few moments in that 25 years, but I got to do it, and Richmond was my club. So I probably had my life job between the ages of 24 and 31 or 32. So that was a wonderful privilege, but it probably also left me with the rest of my life to work out what I was going to do.
No doubt you've rubbed shoulders with some pretty incredible leaders in the game.
Yeah.
What do you think it was that Ron Barassi saw in you, and what are one or two of the things that you've learned most from an individual like that?
Yeah, it's a great question. So I've had reason to reflect, because he passed away in just over a year ago, and I later even had the opportunity, because I was CEO of Richmond when we appointed Alan Jean's coach, who again, so there were four generational coaches of that era, Hafey, Barassi, Jeans, and John Kennedy. And John Kennedy was actually chairman of the AFL Commission whilst I was a CEO. So I got to know him, not certainly to the same degree as working and being around them, mostly so Jeans and Barassi, because I worked with them every day of my life. So I would say with Ron, I think he would have seen my appetite for the game. I think he would have, that I couldn't get enough of it. And I think I was quite an immature young person in lots of ways, but had a maturity around the game because of my upbringing, where I understood all aspects of it. I recognised really early in the piece and that the game's wonderful and it promises just so many remarkable things to be a part of. But the one thing it doesn't promise to be is fair. And I experienced that a lot. And not that I thought the world was treating me in any unfair way, just that the game always has that. It has the capacity for greatness, but it has the capacity for lousy as well. And so there was always a certain romance around the folklore and the game itself. I genuinely, from a very young age, understood both sides to the coin. And so probably I had a maturity in the sport which was beyond my maturity in life, and he saw that. But I think he also thought that I just probably might have had a good eye for what the game asks, what he wanted from the athletes and the footballers who got to play for us in the way that he sought to play, if that makes sense. That he wanted to play the game in a certain way, and there were certain types of players that I thought would fit into that way of playing. And I'm not sure that in his first few years as coach of the club, there was anyone who was able to perhaps grab that in the way that I did. And that's not there's no ego in that, hopefully. But it was just that I sensed that, for example, if you weren't a competitive person, you were going to struggle to play under Ron Barassi, as skilled as you could be. And so my focus was in, recruiting a guy like Todd Viney, for example, to the club, who was a highly competitive person, and his son, Jack Viney, might have even trumped his dad, from that perspective. And I was only 20 or 21 when I recruited Todd to the club at the time, or when we recruited club based on my recommendation. And so I think he recognised that. And also I would challenge him as well when I felt that he wasn't bringing that sense of, he didn't give me enough context by which I could go and watch players play. I didn't want to just go and watch. It's easy to put a little tick on a footy record next to someone who can clearly play the game, but can he play the game well for us? And I wanted to get more insight from him and more understanding from him, which actually led to a really important conversation I had with him. And because I'd spent a lot of time with him, but I'd never really nailed that question about his expectations around players. And I didn't want to just ask him what he looked for in a player. I didn't have any. I thought that was just too generic, if you like. And so the question I asked him, and there's always a power in a question. I think whenever even as you sit there now, we're always looking for the power in the next question. And the question I asked him is, what makes the great players great? I wanted to know what made the special players special. There are players who are just different again, and there might only be 10 in the competition at any one time, but they're the ones who they can make differences when the differences need to be made in that sense. What makes the great players great? And initially couldn't answer the question. He started writing the names of all the great players that he'd coached and he'd played with. And he'd been a part of 10 premierships by this stage of his life. And almost in an act of frustration, he said, Cameron, the best players are better than human nature. They're better than human nature. And I've always loved that response, because human nature will take us into it'll take us into the lazy, it'll take us into the busy, it'll take us into, scrolling when we should be, scrolling our phones instead of reading a book, whatever it might be. When the alarm goes in the morning, I won't go for that walk or that jog or that ride or the gym or whatever it might be. Human nature will mean that we overestimate the challenge we're facing and underestimate our capacity to deal with it. There's all forms of human nature around that. And the amazing thing was, years and years later, I reminded him of the conversation that we had and what a profound effect it had on me, and he couldn't remember it in any shape or form. It was because he's probably having 10 similar-ish conversations with people, and because it's me with Ron Barassi, it means a whole lot more to me than it does to him. In that sense, and so it taught me two things. That the message was wonderful, and I think the message was wonderful because he dug it out of himself. He didn't just give me the obvious stuff. It would have been really easy. So they're just tough, or they keep their eyes on the ball, or they kick both feet. Well, there could have been a really obvious answer to that question, but he knew there was more being asked of him. And in that moment, he also recognised how important it was for me. So he met me where I was at as a young person, him as, the most senior person probably, or the most respected figure maybe ever in the game, or, perhaps, yeah. But then the other thing it taught me was the power of the little 5-minute conversation, the little 10-minute conversation that you get to have. That the most important conversations aren't necessarily the ones where, we sit down and have like an hour performance appraisal or, all that sort of stuff. It's the ones where someone's prepared to deeply connect with us in a deep way and share a part of themselves, and even a part of themselves which is at that point almost a work in progress. It wasn't like this is what I've always thought. It was nothing like that at all. My theories on this are 1, 2, and 3. There was none of that. It was him working stuff out almost in front of me and come up with that lovely way of articulating it And the message has stayed with me forever, even though he forgot it probably 2 minutes later. So that's and again, that's the power of leadership and the importance of just treating each conversation you get to have with someone with I think to honour it almost in some ways, to be the teacher, not the teller, to embrace teaching as part of it rather than telling it. And I was more than happy just to be told by Ron Barassi, but he challenged me with the idea. And that might only mean something to me, but I reckon as you're sitting there, you're thinking, shit, that's a lovely quote, isn't it? That's a lovely line. And I've now shared that with 1 million people. I reckon that little idea of better than human nature, it's really, truly stayed with me.
Thanks, Cameron. So a related question. I can only imagine that being the CEO of an AFL sporting team comes with real challenge and real pressure, but the leadership that you're displaying, it's on show and there's expectations from not just hundreds, but hundreds of thousands of people. How did you go about navigating that in your career and operating with that significant weight of external expectation?
No, again, a good question. A couple of things I'd say is there is very much a public nature to it. So I'll talk to that in a minute. But there's a very private aspect to it as well. It's like, how are you when you're on your own? Yeah, when you're stuck in your own thoughts. When you're driving home from games, and this did happen often, more often than it should have, where we might have a run of losses or... and in the end, clearly on match day, you don't control the outcome of a game. But the role of CEO or the role of a leader is to create the conditions that enable a group of people to be the best they can. And in an AFL club, there's the most measurable version of that is the football team and the performance of the team. And a lot of the roles I took on were clubs which they weren't ready to win yet, and there was a turnaround scenario for them. But there were times, no doubt, that I'd be driving home, and I reckon even at times I uttered this out loud, was the thought that I think I might be fucking the whole thing up. And one time I did utter that in front of my wife, and she didn't say anything. This was at Freo, I remember it, driving home. And we're getting out of the car, and she said, "Don't ever say that again." And it wasn't a "don't ever say that again" as in I believe in you or I love you, I care for you or anything like that. It was, we have shifted our family from one side of the country to the other. You're never home. You're on planes the whole time. Our kids are being judged by the performance of the team, not just, because my surname's well known in Perth. All the stuff the complexities of their lives. And you're thinking like that? And it was really quite profound for me. So it's not just how you're operating when you're being watched, it's how you're operating when you're not being watched. I find it to be far more important. And so if you're not prepared, for example, to ask yourself the question regularly of what the role actually expects of you at this phase, this stage, wherever it's at, even if you're going great and, we're winning and we're doing well, the role has an expectation of you. And sometimes it's just to get out of the way, to be honest. But even when we're losing, sometimes the expectation is to get out of the way and just allow it. So just having that, enough sense of the environment at that time. And so what the role expects of you normally breaks down to what does each of the situations that you find yourself expect of you. Well, the situation of me driving home and saying, I think I might be fucking the whole thing up, is not what the role expects of me. Because if I'm thinking like that and I've got my hands on the levers so what chance have we got? We've got none. And in the meantime, I'm also making all the other important things around me, putting enormous pressure on them, that all forms, all of the scaffolding that we need to build for ourselves to hold the thing up is at risk of collapse in those moments. So I found the quiet time to be the most important time when you're in your own thoughts and being really quite systematic. Like, for instance, I would regularly ask the question, what does the role expect of me? But I'd also ask the question, what do I expect of the role? Because it's reasonable that you have expectations of it as well in that sense. And almost an overarching question, what do I expect of myself? And that was the one I was failing. The role was asking something of me of which I wasn't meeting, and I was actually, again, I reckon almost dishonouring it. by thinking and operating in that space. And then, yes, there is then the external factors within it all, and recognising that ultimately it's unlikely or that we're ever going to meet on a consistent basis the elevated expectations of an AFL club. That's just its reality. And probably the thing that I had to learn over time is that it was going to be measured in a very binary way. It was going to be measured as you're a winner or a loser, it's black, it's white, you're a hero or a villain. It was going to be what that. Whereas my experience, even from the greatest people, even people like your Barassis, was that we're all flawed, people trying to do the best we can in that moment, and often are making errors, often making poor judgment calls, allowing the thing to get the better or whatever. It's a far more complex and nuanced and ambiguous world of which you have to stay in the place of, knowing that it's going to be measured in a very black and white binary hero, villain, winner, loser way. And if you're not careful, if you're going into that binary space, that one or the other space, well, you might as well go and sit in the grandstand. But, if you're not up for the nuance of it, if you're not up for the complexity of it, if you're not up for the mistakes you will inevitably make, which will often be the best lessons and create the most progress, because it at least takes one option off the table, you might as well sit in the grandstand. Just become a supporter. Don't become a CEO. And I think that's the choice we make. Becoming a leader, often people like the idea of leadership, the purpose, the identity, all of those things. And we can all learn a system of leadership, but we're defined by what the role asks of us on a day-by-day basis and our capacity to manage in that space. And so I often go, I like there's a who, there's an identity, there's a why, there's a purpose, there's a how, there's a system, but it's what it asks of you which is going to test you. And so how do you get good at the what? Where everyone wants to talk about the other shit. But if you're not good at the what, it's all just theory up until that point. And that's why, and you and I have talked about it, you've never led unless you've woken up in the morning, your first thought's fuck. Because you are dealing in that ambiguity. If you're not facing into that ambiguity, again, go and sit in the stand. Don't waste our time. Let someone else do it. Because you're basically dishonouring leadership if you're not prepared to go to that place.
Amazing comments. Thank you. So if we think about this in the context of farming, Cameron, the industry and the environment that farmers navigate is incredibly complex on a lot of levels. Often it feels like it's not fair, and the results and the cards that we get dealt can feel lousy, to your point before.
Yeah.
And I think we've got to be careful how we measure our success. Often with farmers, it's the bank balance, or it's the yield, or it's the price, or it's the result, which are often not the right measures of success. And I think at the same time, so many farmers underplay and downplay the leadership role they play in business and in their family and in community. First question on that is, how should we respond as leaders when the cards we get dealt feel like they're not quite fair?
I think as an overarching thing, as an idea, you have to sign up for all things that it's going to ask of you. You just can't sign up for sunny days and perfect rain. The inevitability of doing something which is difficult, and by any dimension this is difficult, is that things are going to work in our favour, work against us. There are going to be days we're unjustly enriched as well, aren't there? There are going to be days where everything does fall in our favour and it's perfect. But my experience in leadership, and I'm sure the same in farming, is, for every lick of the ice cream we get 10 kicks in the bum. That would be, my take. Which is a David Parkin quote, and I love it. So the thing which kills any chance of performance, and leadership is ultimately about creating the conditions for a form of performance. You have to define what that looks like, and I'll talk a little bit about that, is the recognition always that mistakes will be made, things won't work out in our favour, but there is an opportunity to go to blame every time. Like, blame is there everywhere. There's always someone to blame. And every so often there's merit in the blame. I'm not saying it's not without merit, but also know there's no future in it. And it attracts a crowd. I think what's happened a lot, for instance, in the political scenario, particularly in the US at the moment, is that we are drawn to the someone to blame thing. And so therefore whatever the alternative to that blame piece is, we find ourselves somehow attracted to, because it takes responsibility away from us in that way. And so what the only thing we can be measured by is our capacity to respond to the circumstance that we find ourselves in. So I have quite a simple system on that. When I talked about what does the role expect of me, I think the role is basically made up of 1,000 different situations or moments, and hopefully the overarching idea of what we're trying to do and how we best achieve it, all those things. That's what the role is. But it's how we respond in moments. So if you think, what does this moment expect of me? And I would literally, and I talk about a practice of reflection and just taking a pen and paper out and literally asking yourself this question. Even if you're in the negotiation with a bank and, whatever it might be, I would be in the middle of a discussion about trading a player. And I'd go, what does this moment expect of me? Because I'm finding that my emotions in that moment are going to let me down. Like, for example, I've never made a good decision, I don't think, in my life when I'm angry. And so the natural competitive instinct anyone who's lived my life has an upside, yes. But in my experience, it was mostly a downside, because it would actually draw on emotions and potentially feelings which weren't going to serve me well, and certainly weren't going to serve the organisation well. Like me driving home thinking I'm fucking the whole thing up is not serving anyone well in that moment. So I'd go, what does this situation or what does this moment expect of me? And I'd write down 4 words. And the first word I'd write down is calm. What would a calm leader do now? How often have we fired off an email and we've woken up in the morning going, oh, God. One, it's more likely because you're angry, you have about 1,000 spelling mistakes in it, or you've stuffed it up in some other way, or you've added someone into the CC list who shouldn't have been, or something along those lines. We've all done it, So, if you write the email because you might want to get it out of your system, just don't send it. So what would a calm leader do? The second one is, what would a brave leader do? And I would say you cannot lead the thing which takes you out of leadership, anything of any nature, of any form of responsibility, parenting, anything you like. If you're not prepared to be brave, don't do it. Don't do it. It's going to ask things of you that you never thought you were capable of going down that track. And the good thing is about being brave is that each time you're brave, the next time you have to be brave, it doesn't feel as brave next time. It's just that feeling. The third one I always write down is humble. What would a humble leader do now? Because in moments of real challenge, your instinct is to make it about you. And so one of my favorite lines about leadership is it's all on you, as in responsibility sits with you, but it's actually not about you. And it's so easy to turn it and make it about you. And another line which I've used a lot, I'm doing a little bit of work with Carlton and their leadership, and I say, if it's not happening in you, it can't happen through you. And so the minute you lose your humility as a leader and you start to, it becomes about your ego, you basically saying there's no means it can happen through me in that way. And the fourth one is compassion. What would a compassionate leader do now, or a kind leader? Because often in those moments, there's 2 forms of compassion. There's compassion for others, definitely. And even when you're in negotiation, compassion for the people who are on the other side, because they're dealing with whatever they're dealing with as well. But often it's just self-compassion, is that you're actually being pretty tough on yourself. And I'm not talking about lowering standards, lowering expectations, all those sorts of things. But often we're not ready for the standard and the expectation that we're asking of ourselves and of others. And we have to just take our time on that. Like when a coach can't come into an AFL environment, and they've won 2 games and expect to win 15 games next year. There might be some freaky reason that can happen, but that's highly unlikely. And if you're going to align your self-worth to some sort of outcome of which you have, not as much control as you'd like to think. Neil Craig's got a wonderful way of thinking. He says, I think we need 2 egos. Neil Craig coached Adelaide and I got to know him as a good friend. He's done a lot of work with Eddie Jones and he's like a coach's truth teller these days. He's actually a guest on my podcast, In the Arena. It's a wonderful episode. He talks of this in this podcast, actually. He says, I think we need 2 egos. We need the performance ego, which is sort of the I got this ego. I'm up for this ego. This challenge is not beyond me ego. And then we need the quiet ego, which is saying, but I'm still here as a learner. I'm still curious. I've got the courage to unlearn. The chance, if I'm going to make a mistake, I'm going to bring my mistakes into the room so others can learn from my mistakes. We're going to take my mistakes as an opportunity to grow as an organisation or a team or a farm, whatever it might be. And I really like that idea. And I've only come across that more recently. And I've coached to it. And I think I grew up with a whole generation of leaders who thought you only needed one, just needed that performance ego, to be the most, we want all eyes on me, mate, all eyes on me. Well, that's just bullshit, isn't it? So probably, I think that little system, those little moments of reflection, because the one thing about complexity is it encourages you to move quicker, but velocity is never the answer for complexity. It just never is. And you just need to be able to slow down. And that's just a moment whereby you can just slow down and ask yourself one really lovely question. And then what ought a calm, humble, brave and compassionate leader do in this moment? And it'll drag out the best part of you and also reduce the chances of the world seeing the worst part of you as well. So that's the other side of that, because, mate, we've all fucked it up. We've all made that mistake.
Thanks for sharing that system. And I can only emphasise for our listeners the importance of taking that moment to self-reflect and journal when you are under the pump, when life doesn't seem fair, when you're triggered by something, be it a conversation or a negotiation, just to ask, what does this role expect of me? What does this moment expect from me? And what would a calm, brave, humble and compassionate leader do? To stop and reflect and journal around that. I think I can only see that, Cameron, what a great system, can only have you turn up and back to the situation, more likely to be your best self in that moment.
Yeah, and you can reflect it in, it's obviously the relation to the work they're doing here. And I know that being on a farm is more than just your work, but parenting is the same. You receive, tough news, you receive, you get a major health thing or something like that. The same four things apply. And it's when you're in a situation where you know that your emotions or your feelings are likely to betray you. And so I think we can have principles in life which we can trust in the knowledge that our emotions may well betray me when I don't want them to. Like, we've all got angry driving home, or we've all got angry, when the plane, something goes wrong when we're sitting at an airport or whatever it is, of which we've got no control over whatsoever. And, and we feel this need to take it out on some poor person who's got, again, about as much control as what we have, to that outcome. And why would we want the world to see the very worst part of ourselves when, and I've got this little, and often I'll just, it's a funny little way of thinking, but it goes back to my Richmond background and the Richmond of the Tigers. And when I feel that the temperature change in a way where, you're in conversation with someone and you're about to you're about to get the Gatling gun out or something like that. Well, you just end up, all I say is just easy, Tiger. I say to myself, easy, Tiger. And it just sort of slows me down in that moment. Just easy, Tiger. And it's funny, and I half smile inside whenever I say it, because I know that, so it's nice to even have a little mantra that you might use in that moment, like it's, another one I often use is, if I'm feeling nervous or a bit not ready for whatever the world's going to throw at me, I just go, inhale love, exhale joy. Inhale love, exhale joy. Because we can often think our worlds are like much worse than what they are. And so I often just do I literally will inhale. I will take a breath in, inhale the love. Like I'm so grateful for the opportunities that I've been given in my life. But just, there are times I forget just how grateful I should be. And so I inhale love, exhale joy. When I look at my kids, or I, even think about some of the people I've got to meet and work with over my life. There was a lot of luck in all of that. So let's be thankful, for goodness sake. Yeah.
But gratitude and maintaining perspective is just so important in the heat of battle or when we're under real pressure as a leader. Is that a fair comment?
Yeah, I think in anything, mate. You think of the great athletes, you think of the great cricketers, facing into, terrible scenarios. If we think of almost anything which has given us the most joy in, whether it's in witnessing a sporting scenario or, when you hear about kids in Thailand getting saved when you think it's when someone or something found an unbelievable part of themselves that they didn't know existed until that point. And as I said, that then creates, and the term I use is a new point of departure. I handled that okay. I know I'll be okay next time. And so the reflection often is taking you back to that time where you did handle things okay. I've been in here before. This is not unfamiliar space for me. And I learned some lessons last time, and then the time after that I did it okay, so let's go back to that place again. So I seek to slow it down is my first instinct. And again, if you think of the great athletes, they're players who can, if you're I love cricket, like the great batsmen, they get their feet in the right place early, or they just see the ball earlier, or there's something happening whatever millisecond earlier. Scott Pendlebury, the great Collingwood captain, who just can stand in the middle of the MCG with 90,000 people screaming at him and just stop. He can stop with the ball in his hand, with 35 other players around him, with 90,000 people, with whatever. And I feel enough comfort in this moment just to stop. And then, there's a kick. I'll kick it over there. But they're the special ones. Yes, there's a little bit of instinct in all of that, but I reckon he's worked on that as part of what he brings for a long time. And I see no reason why the pause, the deep breath, the notes on a piece of paper, that just gives you the best chance of whatever you do next, what you do now to try and create what happens next. You're giving it at least, mate, if it's the Melbourne Cup, mate, at least we're going to give it a run,
Perspective and composure.
Yeah, so that'd be two wonderful, like almost trademarks to have. So the word I write, and I do this every day, so I write finding something at the top of the page, finding something. So I think that's the best part of me as I define me. So is this idea of finding something. And it came out of, setbacks initially, where I actually got the sack as a CEO and I got myself in a terribly dark place, and it included clinical depression, the whole thing. And I realised I had to find something. But now it's probably less about that, although I have to always be mindful of that, like we always do when you've had those sorts of health struggles. But for me, it's now about finding, like I'm no longer a CEO of an AFL club. What is the thing I need to find? There are moments when we think we've got nothing, like nothing. The world feels like it's giving us nothing, but there's always something. And so how do we actually take a view when it feels like nothing, that it can be something? And so I'm not in this conversation now with you unless I've lived the life that I've had and I've made some sense of the life that I've had through the work that I now do. Would that be fair? That's what's created this opportunity. And so that's when I left the game, I thought I've got nothing, And it had the prospect of taking me down a very dark road all over again. Then I remembered, no, I've got something. And I only sort of come to that idea in the last little while, that because often I'm sure there's guys who will listen to this podcast and think, I've got nothing. Like they might have come off a relationship which is broken down, or they might have a health issue, or, the relationship with their children isn't what it needs to be, or, all the complexities and, that I've allowed myself to get terribly out of shape, or my health's failing me because I'm dining at the banquet of my consequences of having an unhealthy life until this point. But you've still got something. It feels like nothing, but you've got something. How do you leverage the something? Don't find yourself wallowing in the nothing. That's the first time I've ever spoken about that. So I don't know if that makes sense.
I really appreciate you being so open, Cameron, around that. And a question I wrote down before we started that I really did want to ask is on this point. If I'm sure you've coached so many elite athletes, CEOs and others in their time of hardship, when how they're turning up isn't them at their best or where they want to play. How do you help someone in the dark place or not on their A game go about redefining their story and shifting their identity to the person that they kind of need to shoot for or become in order to sort of move forward with sort of conviction? How do you do that?
The first thing I'd say is it's situational. So you need to be able to meet the person where the person's at. And that means not expecting them in their times of challenge to meet you where you're at. And again, sounds a bit crazy, but I learned this mostly because I did deal with clinical depression. If I went in, saw the person who was trying to help me and support me, and he or she just said, "No, here's what you do." If I felt they didn't have any empathy for, even though I'm not the first person who's walked into that office, they've got probably 10 of me that day or 5 of me that day, whatever it might be. If that person doesn't meet me where I'm at in that moment, I've got the wrong person trying to help me. And my wife's a clinical psych, so I've seen how that plays out. And so that idea of what leadership will ask of you, well, that's the thing you have to be able to do, is meet the group where the group's at, meet the individual where the individual's at. And the person has got to that point in their life for a reason, the same way as I got to that point in my life for a reason. And to unpack that sometimes is part of the deal, but sometimes moving forward is just part of it as well. So that's your idea. So the one thing that I learned from some of those experiences that I've had is that, to make change happen, you're in charge. So any form of change in your life, you're in charge. And so to give the person the sense that even though I'm here in support of them, and I'm not an advice giver, the one thing I do say that. I go to my accountant for advice, I go to my lawyer for advice, and I certainly go to my doctor for advice, more than advice. But I don't go to someone who's going to coach me for advice. So all I'm seeking to do is give them the sense that for something to move here or shift here, something's going to have to change. And so almost in many ways, like before I coach someone, the first question I ask is, are you up for change? I know that can be very intimidating because sometimes the change might be, why don't you just go for a walk each morning? Why don't you journal? Something which is easy to do but easy not to do in that way. So if you're not up for change, I think I'm the wrong person for you. I'm saying you still need to be up, but I'm probably not the person who's going to encourage that from you. But don't give up. The second one is, are you up for feedback? And there will be feedback which will come through the coaching process itself, because we will have conversations which will, we're talking about things and we'll share ideas, and all the ideas are a form of feedback. Like if you read a book, all the book is giving you feedback, really. It might be actually saying something to you which is a different view on how you see the world than whatever. And you go, well, is there something in that for me? It might be something in it for you, but not me in that way. Our circumstances in our life and our current state is giving us feedback. Like if you're someone who drinks too much and it's affecting your life, well, that's giving you feedback. And then we've got more formal structures. Sport builds on feedback a lot, So if I'm dealing with a leader, I go, well, okay, people don't experience your intention. They don't experience your intentions, actually experience your behaviours. So how are people experiencing you? That's feedback. But I'm writing a book at the moment. No one tells the CEO their baby's ugly. And sometimes it's hard to get good feedback from people, So you have to create an environment where that happens. So the first one is, are you up for change? Are you up for feedback? Then the third one is, are you up for action? Are you prepared to do something? And sometimes it's the smallest thing that we just ask for, because some progress is better than no progress. And unfortunately, a lot of the people I deal with, because they're often high-performing people, they're quite perfectionistic in the way that they go about things. And, there's no perfectionism is like it's like comparisons and all that sort of stuff. It's like the thief of joy, I reckon. And so, yes, have standards, have expectations, but perfectionism is just bullshit. And unfortunately, we've sort of grown up with some ideal of that. And the idea we compare ourselves, my work in progress with someone else's very developed version of themselves. And we all do it. It's part of our sort of tribal instinct to compare ourselves. And then the fourth one is, are you up for accountability? Are you prepared to hold yourself to some form of account? And so before entering into any coaching arrangement, they're the four things that we'll talk about. But I'm also saying that the steps could really be small, and that's okay. And then so when it comes to the change process itself, I sort of embrace 4 ways of coaching: change, feedback, action, accountability, the 4 things. I think everyone should be up for those 4 things, by the way. That's just part of it. And so with it, coach. So even if I'm coaching, so I do some stuff with Michael Voss at Carlton, who's coaching Carlton. And so I say, sometimes, Vossy, I'm going to be a sounding board for you. And I think we need people who are just sounding boards for us. But the idea of just being a sounding board depends a lot on the fact that the person's given it a fair bit of work and a fair bit of thought already. Because if you want me to be your sounding board and you've given it no thought or you've done no work on it, Well, I can't be a sounding board because it's not a well thought out idea. It's not you haven't done the. And so then often you then say, well, in that case, you might become a truth teller. And it's truth in inverted commas. It's not truth because it's just a version of the truth. Like it might be that you thought I was going to be a sounding board, but it seems to me you haven't given that as much thought as perhaps you could have. Maybe let's rethink this. Which I've got to say with Michael Voss, that doesn't happen very often. He's a very thoughtful person. Then the third one is to be an idea sharer. Let's just share some ideas. So even this conversation now, this is an idea sharing conversation. I'm just sharing ideas. Are they right? Are they wrong? Do they work for you? Well, I don't know. But it's just ideas. We're not a cult. We're not a religion. We're not a doctrine. It's just ideas. And we need to know what your idea is so we can use your idea to try and get to best idea. The goal is best idea, not your idea, So then I'd become an idea sharer. So you give another, perhaps different context, different way of thinking, something you learned, some experience you've had. And then the fourth one, which happens a lot, is you partner with the person. You try and work it out together. I haven't got the answer. You haven't got the answer. Let's bloody hit the whiteboard. Let's go for a walk and talk it through. Let's mind map it. Let's sticky note it. You know what I mean? There's just get some creative thinking into this thing somehow. So I've just described my whole approach to coaching, if you like. The four things you need from the person, and then the four things that I offer the person in regard to that. And just having those systems in my head is always handy. They're just straight away you go, is this a well thought out idea? And you're going, and you think about it with your kids, you got teenage kids that come home and you go, well, mate, you can go from sounding board to truth teller pretty quickly with a 16-year-old kid, So that's how it is, because a 16-year-old kid pretty much thinks they know most things. When we know they don't know many things, but we also know that we were a 16-year-old kid who thought we knew most things as well. So
I really appreciate your comments. How do you help people change their story? I think so many of us have stories that aren't serving us, that might be on autopilot or whatever. And I would only imagine that those high performers, a key part to them making a major shift in how they turn up to their leadership roles in their teams is that they rewrite their story. Would you mind just speaking to that and how it is that you support someone to check in on a story that might not be serving them and then replace that with something that might?
Yeah. And it probably comes back a little bit to my nothing something concept. It is only a story. Look, and I do a lot of writing and often it's quite reflective and every so often I had a colourful but pretty complex upbringing, would be fair to say. And as I mentioned before, it gave me opportunities of which little choice of mine, but sort of the nature-nurture thing was mostly in my favour. But there were times where it was really quite traumatic as well. And so I can often think, oh, that's how it served me. And I can have a conversation with my sister, and she's 3 years older, and we'll talk about the same stage of life. And she, being a girl, being a boy, girls grow up quick, or in a maturity sense, as well as being 3 years older than me. She goes, it wasn't like that at all. Like a time of joy for me might be a time of sadness for her. And we lived in the same environment, same house. So we all have our stories. And I think we then go, well, what insights, what is it? Is it serving me the way that it needs to? But there's also the recognition some things in life will never be resolved, and I think some forms of grieving like that, even say ideas around loss, like even concepts around grieving. My father died because he got drunk and got drugged. That's how my dad died. And that's over 30 years ago. And he's a big person in my life, as you can sense. But I talk about him all the time. Even the way he died, I talk about it. And because it's shaped my life like nothing else has. There's still part of me which feels like a bit of me broke off and shattered into a million little pieces. But when I get to talk about him, it's like he's sort of still part of me, still with me. And I'm a lot older than what he was than when he died. So I've lived a life beyond that. But I remember even growing up thinking, shit, how's it? Oh, when I was getting closer to his age, thinking, shit, what's that gonna feel like, And Nick Cave's got this wonderful way of thinking about grief, and I'm a Nick Cave fan. His music's certainly not for everyone, but he's lost two sons in the last sort of 10 years of his life. One was only 15, and he talks about them all the time. And his idea is that he feels like they're still with him now. They're still part of part of him. And I know that's not for everyone, but it feels to me like that happening is like your love outliving their life, your love of that person outliving their life. And, you still want to love them like you always love them, even though you get to. And in some ways, I feel like I know my dad better now than I ever knew him, because I talk about him a lot, and I'm also now able to relate the context of my life to the life he was having at that point. And not dealing, I'd like to think I'm dealing with it in a far healthier way, that he was a big drinker, my dad, and it wasn't serving him well, certainly. So I can tell that story either way, can't I? I can tell the story of loss, and it certainly has that element to it. But I know that there were other good things which came from it, which sound weird. Is I stopped being Alan Schwab's son, which I'd always been up until that point in my life. And within 3 or 4 years, no one thought of me as Alan Schwab's son anymore. Where I reckon I would, if he was alive now, he'd be in his 80s, but that could easily have happened. I'd still be Alan Schwab's son, because he was such a big persona and a big person in the game. And so, I got to define me and my identity probably before I was ready in that context, because I'm not sure you're ever ready from that perspective. So our story is, so my way of doing it is I write them down. I just write them. I look at my life and I go, if I was Bruce Springsteen, and I love the album Nebraska, and it's like 7 or 8 stories, whatever it is. And my life was a Bruce Springsteen version of Nebraska. What would each of the song titles be of the most defining elements of my entire life? And there might be a couple of songs dedicated to my dad, because I don't reckon I could cover it off in 3 minutes and 20 seconds or whatever his thing is. But I look at those things now as the things that have shaped me. And I know it's the hard days that define you. And as much as I've had these wonderful, joyous moments, if someone said, what's really shaped you? Yeah, there would be the obvious things about the jobs you've had, becoming a parent, all of those things. But it's mostly your response to the times when you thought you were fucked. That would be the ones that have shaped me the most.
Appreciate your sharing and your comments, but what a great example of, and a reminder of how we can rewrite our story or choose which side of that story we want to take on and have support where we're at and where we move to. Thank you for that.
Thank you. Thanks, Jerry.
One other question, if I could, Cameron. How do you create the right conditions? I've heard you mention that a couple of times, and I've seen you speak to this, that when you arrive into an underperforming team, or when the team that we lead isn't where we want for it to be, how do you, as the leader, create an environment that can see people play at their best and that can support high performance or meaningful change?
Yeah. The first one is you do have your own standards, values, and expectations. You've brought clarity to your own philosophies on what you think a high-performing environment looks like in this case, a relatively general sense. And then recognise that the thing's underperforming for a reason. The roles that I took in as a CEO were when the clubs were in a really poor place. And people often say, was that the thing you like to do? Well, in the end, I did a bit, but that was mainly where the opportunities were. That's really where it played out, because, they had situation vacant against their CEO role. That's really how it was. And so the obvious thing to do in those cases is to think that you've got to ride in on your white horse with the person with all the answers. What that does is the group itself's gone through a lot more challenge and difficulty than what you have coming into those roles. They've experienced it. So we need to, and I used the term before, we need to meet the group where the group's at, not ask them to meet you where you're at. And I only know that because that is something that I made a meal of. Be clear on what your standards and expectations are, but also recognise and understand that there's a chance that the group will have to grow to meet those. And you will have to make some compromises as part of that as it grows to understand those, because the chances are they're going to have to make some changes. But if you make the changes in a prescriptive and structured and whatever way, and you have to sort of avoid, your own sort of ego, particularly in those moments, well, the chances are you're going to miss the dartboard. And in each of the environments I went to, I found that there was a lot more positive things going on than negative things going on. They just needed love, support, care, direction, sense of purpose, all the stuff that a leader needs to be able to bring. But in terms of the pure capability and capacity of the group, there was a lot more in the group than what I thought there was. But then there were also those who, unfortunately, were either always going to be negative influences against that, the expectations and the standards that you were seeking to set, or they were bloody exhausted by the experience that they've actually gone through, and they're going to have to move on because they don't have the energy and the appetite for what you're going to ask for from them, particularly when it comes to elite environments. Because what happens in elite sport is it's the competition that sets the standard until such time as we're good enough to set the standard ourselves. And I often then think of it as a phased process. And I think the phase one process is a relatively controlling way, because often there is a fair bit of stuff which people need to have, a bit of clarity about, this is what I think we need to be able to do in terms of direction, and then just see how people respond to that. But the other thing you have to do is recognize who are the 3, 4, or 5 critical people inside the organization who you can share the leadership responsibility with. And then you coach and coach and coach and coach those people, because they're the people who are going to be having conversations that you're never going to have as a leader. They're talking to their own teams, their own people, their own customers, their own clients, their own whatever it might be. And so you spend a lot of time coaching those people. And I call that very much it is a controlling, sort of quite directive initially, but you make it clear that you're not going to hold that position forever. I'm not that sort of leader, but we need some straightening up now. And then phase 2 is a much more of a, shared model where you're getting, feedback back. They're getting challenged more by the group. They're asking things of you that you're not giving, all those sorts of things. And then the final phase is very much a cohesion space where we're all in it together. We've worked it all out and we've done the hard yards, and we're starting to get some really good outcomes. Because people say, I want to be an empowered leader. Well, I think to go to that place too early is fraught with danger, because you might be empowering the wrong person, or you might be overwhelming the person. There could be all sorts of things. You might end up finding someone who, wonderful capability, but they're not good, strong people, and they're undermining you in other ways. You might empower someone who's getting good numbers, but doesn't bring good character. So you've got to slow it down. So if I'm coaching leaders now, I'll go, what's your leadership philosophy? And often they'll go to ideas around strategy and this is how I build businesses and all that. No, I want to know how you're going to respond when these things happen. How you're going to model expectations. What are your 4 or 5 critical principles around leadership? And I've sort of shared some of those. Like, I think calm, brave, humble, and compassionate are 4 of my key principles around leadership. And if I've got people in the group who say, mate, that kind stuff, mate, we're not up for kind here. We're all we're head kickers around this joint. I go, well, you're not going to work well in my environment. Because I think the outcome we're trying to get, ultimately what we're trying to do is build a really strong sense of belief, and belief at a whole lot of levels. Belief in the plan, belief in each other, belief in the entity, belief in the work I do, that it's important, it makes a difference. So you're trying to build belief. And then I think in most organisations, you're also trying to create a great sense of belonging, to be a part of something, something bigger than you. And if you've got fuckwits working for you, mate, that kills both of those things. And so you try and you've got to make that choice as early as you possibly can. And because it just kills all forms of connection that you have. And don't worry, I've made that mistake of being beguiled by talent and let poor people hang around too long. I don't teach anything I haven't fucked up. So that's one of the lessons that I learned, definitely.
Thanks, Cameron. Cameron, how do you define leadership, and what do you look for when you seek it out now, given the extensive experience that you've had?
It'd be fair to say that I've changed in regard to that. I think it was when I was a young leader, I almost created this identity for myself and then did my best to try and fit into that identity, if you like, and I found that to be an exhausting experience. Where I think leadership for the person can it be a natural extension of who you are? And be okay with that, be comfortable with that. And that doesn't mean we get to be all things. As I said, you've got to have values and principles around that, be really clear on those things. But leadership for me is based on, almost that double-pronged idea of understanding what the role expects of you, and that will be very much situation dependent, and recognizing what you bring and what you don't bring, in regard to that. And the answer is always create the conditions which enable this group to be at its best. And I think there's certainly mechanics in that, as in systems, but it's also the most important thing is the dynamics. How do people work well? How do they work together and do it in a way which creates the the behaviours which then creates the outcomes for us to do well. And so to answer that question in some ways, I often just talk about, what we focused on right from the start is this: how are you going to show up? Because that's all we ever get to experience of you. As a leader, how are you going to show up? And showing up is in a lot of public arenas, but how are you showing up to yourself is, as I said, I think, are far more important. And so if you're not actually practicing or haven't got a practice for reflection where you're asking yourself questions around how I'm going to show up, well, how do you know how you're going to show up? Because that answer will not be in your inbox. It won't be, no one's going to go and find it for you. And so having just really clear ideas and principles around that, knowing that they will evolve and change and grow, having that performance ego, having that quiet ego, having all these pieces of thinking defined in a way where you go, this is what I bring as a leader. So if I was to ask someone who, okay, what is it that you think you bring? And mostly they go to their insight, their technical insight. But I want to know what you bring as a person to this role. And I'm assuming, you've got an expertise and experience which is relevant to the challenge that we're facing. We can find that off your resume or your LinkedIn profile mostly. But I want to know the essence of you. What is it that you bring? What character do you bring? I don't want to, we'll talk about your capability. Yeah, I want to know about what character you bring and what connection you bring. How are you going to buy in on this thing? Because if you're going to be a leader in our organisation, mate, you've got a big responsibility, because we've got a whole lot of people who their quality of their life, their well-being, their psychological safety, their own ambition, their own goals, all this really important shit in their life is totally dependent on how you show up. So you do the work on that. Because I reckon if I ask most people who are listening to this podcast, how are you going to show up? They'll go, well, yeah, they'll have ideas. But I go, if the pen starts hitting the paper and you start saying, this is my leadership intention, this is how I am going to show up, and you go and share it with those people who are going to experience you, and then you give them permission to say, hang on, just so you know, Cameron, you're not showing up, as you said you were going to show up. There's a bit of a gap there. Well, I reckon I'd want to know that, because it might be that people are experiencing you in a way which is so different to how you think they're experiencing you. Blind spots are called blind spots for a reason, because they're bloody blind, we don't see them. Yeah. So it can sound really complex, but if I just said there's an exercise to people, how are you going to show up? And the reason why I say have a trademark is that is a definition of how you're going to show up. And then if you ask yourself each day what's possible and what's important, it is possible that you show up with a really positive mindset when the shit's hitting the fan. That is possible, but you're going to have to work out how you're going to do it. So it's you in your quiet times. Everyone thinks you get measured by being in a boardroom or being on the footy field or in a coach's box or in front of the media. Mate, it's when no one's watching, when no one at all is watching.
Thank you. Wonderful comment. So you've coached and led elite sporting teams. You've established a highly successful business now that builds leaders in sport, charity, corporate, small to medium business across Australia, and so many other leadership teams. I ask this question of most of my guests. Cameron, what are you most proud of in your career and for the impact that you and your team have made around this really critical topic of leadership?
I think often the things that you're proud of, the things often only you know, when you're driving home and you go, if not for some moment, some initiative, something you handled in a way which was what the challenge asked of you, but no one knew what it took to actually do that in that moment because only you experienced it. They're the things I reflect on most, I reckon. They're the things. And so even, there will be moments in the work I'm doing now where leaders just say, look, this is the work we've done has changed everything for me in this really positive way. And I've got better relationships. I've got a better life, but it's also created some good outcomes for the business. Yeah. So they're the things which that's an energy that you live off all the time. But then there's things which I know that only where you think if you hadn't have shown a certain initiative at a certain time, well, a much bigger outcome wouldn't have happened, at least in the time that it did. Like, for instance, I played a big role in the development of women's football, and I've basically been almost a silent person in that. But but the thing I'm most proud of is I realised that blokes like me were the problem. The game we were holding the game back, because our only perception of how the game should be played is by our only experiences of the game, where there was a whole group of people who had a vision for the sport way bigger than the one that I had. But I had the potential of, enabling their vision. And that was a choice that I made, and at a time when it would have been easy not to. So in terms of my involvement in sport, that's the thing I reflect on most, perhaps, I think. As a person, I think the thing which I still feel, someone who's dealt with clinical depression, they do spend a fair bit of time not feeling good about themselves. That's one thing I would say. But the thing I do feel good about is I think I've got a natural curiosity for growth and learning, and I think I've got a generosity to share it. So I think that's the thing that it's funny, because my business values in Design CEO, the first one's grateful. I'm grateful that I'm on the podcast here. The second one is generous. I'm going to be, our offering's not cheap, but it's generous, if that makes sense. The third one is goodness. It's got to come from a place of goodness, a good part of ourselves, It's got to reek of goodness, in that sort of healthy farmer way, And the last one's a funny little word, and it's a bit Melbourne oriented, is grouse. It's got to be grouse. And grouse is just like growing up when you're a kid and you won a game of footy, and you say, oh, that was just grouse, or you got to skateboard down a hill without falling off the end and got that sort of invigoration. And I grew up in Mount Waverley, so there was no lack of hills to skateboard down. That you got to the bottom and you said to your mates, how grouse was that? So I want the experience of what we do, and the experience of, and it's mostly through me, to be grouse. And so I'm going to take the work seriously, but I'm never going to take myself too seriously.
Cameron, I didn't quite know what to expect at the start of this conversation. We've only just met, but I guess what I didn't quite expect, that I'm deeply grateful for, is just the depth of your thinking, the depth of your philosophy, and the depth of your sharing. I really appreciate just those little insights and those really significant nuggets as you share and reflect on your journey, but on you share how you turn up to high performance people across Australia and help them be better humans and be better leaders. I really am grateful for your time, and I can only imagine that our listeners will get and enjoy so much value from this. To hear from your comments about that high performance space and allow them to self-reflect on how that applies back to how they turn up in their communities, in their businesses, in their families, when the chips are down, when things are going well, and how to self-regulate and self-reflect. I just think, your comments will be so relevant to so many who get to listen to this across Australia. So thank you so much for your time and your generosity today.
No, it's been a pleasure. I really enjoyed the conversation, and my only encouragement is that people just listen to what we've got to say and just think of one thing that they can bring into their own lives, and one thing they might be able to share with someone else. It's really low bar, but that's progress.
Great comment. Thanks so much for your time, mate. All the best.
Cheers. Thank you.
What a wonderful conversation. Thank you, Cameron, for your openness, your honesty, and the depth of your responses to some really important questions around leadership. I love some of the frameworks and the systems for leadership that you spoke about, and some of the really profound questions that you suggest we might call on when being challenged around leadership, or when we're not on our A game, or when we're in adversity. What does my role expect from me? What does this moment require from me? And how would a calm leader turn up? How would a brave leader turn up? What would a humble leader do? What would a compassionate leader do? Some really significant conversations. I liked how you challenged us to sort of slow down and find composure and reflect in the heat of battle on how we can turn up in that moment on our A game. And I liked how you shared with us how to create an environment or a condition for high performance. I think it's all incredibly relevant to how we turn up on our farms as leaders of really significant and emerging companies. A lot of what Cameron talks about is very consistent with the principles, the practices, the standards, and the expectations that we encourage people to set as they move through our FOA business coaching programs and our Platinum Mastermind journey. So I hope all of you find or have found this discussion with Cameron valuable. I encourage you to listen to it at least once and take notes and call on it as you can to improve how you turn up as a leader in your family and your business. Thanks, Cameron, again. Look forward to keeping our connection and this conversation going. Thanks, everyone. Bye for now. Thanks for listening to another episode of the Profitable Farmer podcast by Farm Owners Academy. If you're new to this show, be sure to follow us. If you've been a long-time listener, let your friends know about us or come continue the conversation in the Profitable Farmer Facebook group. All the best as you grow your business and create your freedom farm. Until next time, keep being incredible.